So a warm welcome to you all. Thank you for joining us at GeogLive 4. This session is called Ofsted The View from Here, presented by the Early Years and Primary Phase Committee of the Geographical Association. I'm encouraging people to write into the chat where they're from, and it's a warm welcome from all of us to all of you. We will be recording this, so it's recording as we speak. We encourage cameras to be off to protect your internet and to protect the planet. We are led to believe that if you don't have your image on all of the time, then that does help to reduce your carbon footprint. So we encourage cameras off and obviously listening in. You're all muted, so hopefully there'll be no audio interruptions as we go through. What we'd really like to encourage you to do, though, is to ask questions in the chat. If there's anything that you'd like to pursue in what we discussed today, please do put those thoughts as they come in the chat, and some of my colleagues will be selecting some of those to put to our speaker very, very shortly. So let us know who you are, which age group you teach when you ask questions as well. It's really good to know who in the early years and primary phase community that you are when you come and chat to us. So just as we let the last few people in, I will just tell you what we're here to hear about today. We're going to be welcoming one speaker today and questions from yourselves. We have Ian Freeland, who's Her Majesty's Inspector of Education and Ofsted Subject Lead for Geography. And he's going to be presenting two different sections. Part one is going to be on what the review of early years and primary geography found about the curriculum, followed by some questions and some comment and answers. And then part two is going to be from about hour. What other factors did the review find affect high quality geography education, followed by more Q&A. Just a few dates before we begin for your diary that you should perhaps be aware of that's happening over the next few months and year. As we always say in these sessions, it's really good to welcome you into the geography community, which we hope you feel part of, whether you're a member or not a member of the GA. We have a session in November, which is a focus on maps and mapping. So put that in your diaries and look out on Twitter for the sign up for that. We have a conference, a research conference, the Charney Manor Research Conference that's occurring in February. We encourage you to email our colleague Melanie Norman at btinternet.com, and looking at Twitter at Manor Charney if you want to know more about that. That's an in-person and a hybrid research conference on primary and early years geography. And the big event of the GA for the year, the poster has just been launched this week, is the Everyday Geographies Conference, which will be held in Guildford at the University of Surrey in April next year. So we'd love to see you at some or all of those events. And if you are a member, you'll be possibly aware today or very soon, your current issue of Primary Geography Journal may have leapt onto your doorstep. Mine came today in its lovely paper packet. So do consider subscribing to get a copy of that. Really wonderful set of different articles there. You can see a list there on the screen to give you a real perspective on what's fresh and new in primary geography. And just before we invite our guest speaker to speak, there is further information on the research and the review and Ofsted that Ian has given to the GA through a podcast that's well worth listening to, I would argue, where he spoke to our colleague. You can find that on the GA website or on GeogPod itself. So I'll stop sharing there, and I'll say a warm welcome to anybody else who's joined us. Thank you for joining us on this Wednesday, and we will pass straight over to Ian. A very warm welcome, Ian. And I'll allow you to unmute. There we go. Mute the Ofsted.
There are many who'd like to do that, Anthony. And thank you for the invitation and the opportunity to talk with you this afternoon. I appreciate it. It's been end of a busy day for most of you, and we don't want to keep you too long. But as Anthony said, I'm going to look through two aspects this afternoon. We'll break in the middle for questions. Feel free to answer them. If I can't give you an answer, kind of here and now, then I'll feed something back through Anthony as we go forward. But don't shy away from asking questions, please. I'm sure if you're thinking it, so are about half a dozen others. And we've got, I think I'm looking at my count, 77 on the call at the moment. So I'm sure there's a fair few will be thinking the same thing. Anthony, can you just confirm you can see my screen?
All good, thank you.
Excellent. Okie dokie. So what I'd like to do this afternoon is talk in two parts. First is around curriculum design and planning and some thinking around that we've been doing. You'll be aware, I'm sure, that over the, I don't know, I guess over the summer term, we've published a number of curriculum research review documents for different subjects, and we've published 7 so far. There are more in the offing that will be published later on this term, probably just before Christmas. Another few will come out as we continue the rollout of them. Probably important just to say at this time, these are documents that we've used when we've been devising our training in-house for our inspectors. Many people are using them as discussion documents. That's great. They're not prescribed as being, the answer to what it is, but I just give you the kind of thinking that's been going on here within Ofsted. So I'll share that with you. We'll break. Happy to take questions around those things. And then we'll move on to a second part where we'll look at some of the implementation of the curriculum and see how that's playing out in our schools. So you'll know, I'm sure, there's been much written about what constitutes the scope of geography education in schools. What we found is through our research was that the commonality that exists is actually already reflected in our national curriculum. We're quite fortunate in geography that our national curriculum is well crafted. It works well for us. And actually, I was saying to some colleagues earlier, I went back to the 1906 annals of I think the American Association for Geographers, and they were coming up with the same headings then as we are now, and lots of, I mean, there are different nuances to it, but by and large, these substantive knowledge areas have existed for quite a long time. I think also for those of you who have got nurseries and reception classes, then you'll recognise more clearly, I hope, going forward, the kind of geography that you expect children to know by the end of the early years as well, in the new early years foundation stage documentation that's been coming out. And what the research shows very clearly is that a high quality geography education brings together internal factors, things like careful consideration of the content that's going to be taught, thoughtful organisation of it, judicious choices of teaching approaches that you're going to use, and insightful use of accurate assessment. And they're sort of the big benchmarks into which we can explore things. And then it picks up on the external factors, the decisions and policies that are determined by others that also come into play. We recognise that not everything is in our hands. In terms of content, of course, the national curriculum doesn't spell out for us in any detail the content that we have to teach. We're given some headings, and then we're given free rein. Now that's blessing and curse, depending on where you sit on the geography specialist spectrum. But for many, that's great. It's liberating. It gives you options. It gives you choices. But what that then does do is it foregrounds the importance of teachers' subject and their disciplinary knowledge. And in the research that we did for the education inspection framework, we did that in about 2018. We identified that progress is, we defined it as knowing more, remembering more, and being able to do more. So curriculum planning is going to support this. In areas such as geographical skills and fieldwork, then the teaching, that the methods and the techniques that geographers use to gather first-hand evidence, then to analyse it and present it, will be necessary first and foremost. But it's unlikely to be remembered well unless it's practiced regularly. And some researchers use the language of fluency, or they talk about reaching automaticity. And while we're talking about this strand, the research also showed us the importance of contextualisation and application. So it might be that there's some discrete teaching first, but then pupils should be able to see that method used in different contexts. And we'll know they've got it when they apply it correctly in their own work. One of our findings from inspection evidence reviews is that the examples or case studies that pupils explore could be better thought through. We cover this quite extensively in the research review, particularly picking up on the development of pupils' place knowledge, that appreciation, that empathy for places. And pupils, through their own experiences, will have particular views or appreciations which may not resemble reality. And so when we're choosing specific locations to explore phenomena in, then we need to ensure that they're accurate. This may well challenge preconceived ideas or outdated views that are commonly held. Just take the pictures above. They all present a different view of Mumbai. And I guess this is where we go back to our national curriculum, and we see that it really only sets out those very high level aims. It comments on comparing locations. The detail and the locations to be chosen aren't stipulated, but will require careful choice, making sure that comparisons can be valid and help pupils to see that interplay of those different strands of knowledge that we've identified before. And memory. So as I've said before, pupils knowing more, remembering more, being able to do more is a central thread. Cognitive science shows us the importance of making connections if we're to remember, or what's referred as building that schema or schemata. And that's language that we're starting to use more and more. And we're hearing it more in schools as people kind of use the same vocabulary. What the research also shows is that children need to build from what they already know, their own experiences, and that more complex and composite ideas, or concepts if you like, need to be broken down into their component parts. We might say chunks. So if we link that back to our previous slide, this is where knowledge of one is where the case study approach can be really helpful as pupils deepen their appreciation and their knowledge of one particular location. So in doing so, pupils are building on their prior knowledge in a deliberate sequence that builds onto a composite idea. I think also in thinking structurally about the curriculum, the literature pointed us quite clearly towards the need to revisit and recall knowledge from prior learning and then building on it. In this way, the level of complexity can build as pupils are more secure in their knowledge of the basics. And the connections are the key here. Our subjects beautifully organized to make this happen in so many different ways. So as you know, the journey begins in the early years, and the new EYPPC, as I've said, makes this much clearer for us, more helpful. But now often, and we're seeing in the early years as being thought of too often, I guess, maybe as being its own little entity, and it does its own thing. And I would contend that's quite unhelpful to be at such disjunct from the rest of the school. Crucially, in the early years, children are beginning to acquire some of the geographical vocabulary that they're going to build on through the rest of their schooling. They're building some of those initial concepts, things like distance. You know, it's first encountered formally when we're in the early years. However, if some of that content isn't grasped in nursery or the reception year, then Key Stage 1 colleagues are really going to be always playing catch up right from the start. So one thing, if you are taken away from today, is to think about is how does the curriculum from the early years, whether that's nursery or reception in your school, it will be different. And if you're a junior school, apologies. But if you're in a setting who's got early years, then where does the geography journey start? Can you identify it and can you see how it builds through Key Stage 1 into Key Stage 2 and then on to Key Stage 3? It forming part of that critical journey. Jill Miller, who was past president of the GA, wrote an article not so terribly long ago about a good geography education for the youngest pupils, helping them to understand their world, their role in it, and the responsibilities that come with it. And this is definitely something that children in the early years can and should engage in. It really starts them to invest and for us, helpfully, gain deeper insight into our subject. Practice. I think if I had a mantra for the last 6 months, it would be practice, practice, practice. One of the main findings that we drew out of the review was the need for pupils to reach fluency, whether that's applying their fieldwork techniques, drawing climate graphs, calculating grid references. It is through that repeated practice that pupils reach that fluency, or we're talking about reaching automaticity. They draw a graph and they don't necessarily, by the time we're getting down the line a bit, they're not necessarily having to be taken through it step by step. They're calculating grid references really quickly. They know how to apply some of their fieldwork skills because they've either done it before or they've practiced it in class or they've seen it done. And so we're building that point where children can get on and do it for themselves, because by that point, they know it and they can do it. One of the questions that I get asked a lot is around different approaches to the curriculum, whether that's carousels, thematic approaches, discrete teaching. You know, we see them from an inspectorate point of view. We see them in every primary school that we go to in different forms, shapes, and guises. These models or structures are the servant of the curriculum. So it's really important, I think, that leaders and teachers think carefully about how their curriculum plans are going to be implemented. Thinking about how pupils remember, their ability to practice, and the regularity of that recall are important features of curriculum design. And it's important that these are respected if their children are going to remember the content that's been selected and emphasized by their teachers. In thematic or topic-based approaches, teachers will need to be expert in their subject, pedagogical, and their disciplinary knowledge of their subjects that have been incorporated to ensure that the clear curriculum goals for each subject aren't lost or diluted, and that we respect each subject's discipline is different. And that's a real challenge, and we know that's a real challenge for the workforce, as in the foundation subjects, we don't often have that subject specialist expertise. And we see, although now, more recently, as teacher training providers adapt and change the ways in which they're inducting new colleagues into the profession, of deepening that and doing that better, it'd be fair to say that's not always been the case in the past. And so this is something that we need to develop within our workforce. And I'm grateful to the Geography Association, but also to others like the RGS and others out there who are doing work to facilitate that, and it makes good progress in this area. But we do recognise it's a challenge, and I want to sit here as a member of the inspectorate, but suggest to you we recognise the journey that schools are on in the foundation subjects. And in fact, you'll see in the inspection handbook some amelioration for the next 2 terms, where we re-evaluate how schools are getting on, and we'll review our view on transition arrangements for curriculum going forward. I should imagine early in the spring term. I guess what I've just done in those first few slides, because Anthony didn't give me terribly long, but there we go, and we've managed it in about 15 minutes, gives you kind of an overview of some of the findings. You can read the research review in more details. I'm sure somebody who's much more technically competent than me will put some links in the chat, both to the research review, but also to the blog that we did for outstanding geography primary geography schools, outstanding primary schools geography inspections from the spring 2020. And you get all the detail there and lots more besides. But probably a good juncture for me to stop and take any of the questions that people have got around curriculum design principles, how that's playing out in their geography curriculum, where they're at in their thinking. I'll stop sharing so I can start to see some faces.
Thank you, Ian. Thank you for that starting point for us all. Paula Owens has put a question in the chat, which maybe I'll put to you based on what you just said. Many find the selection of regional comparisons at Key Stage 2 very tricky, especially regarding the scale of study. Sorry, there's an echo. I'll just sort it out. What advice would you give about what Ofsted might consider good practice when selecting and teaching regional comparisons, and maybe some must-avoids?
Sure. Great. I think that's a good question, one that colleagues often struggle with a bit. I guess the point to start with is what are you trying to get children to appreciate? What do you want them to know by the end of it? And there are some disciplinary things we want to respect. We want to respect things like scale. And Paul knows, Paul and I have talked about an example before of comparing a very small island with a whole nation. And I guess my question is, what was the purpose of that? So I think if you keep at the forefront of your mind, what am I trying to demonstrate here? What do we want children to know as a result of making this comparison? Then you're on steady ground. The second thing probably colleagues might want to think about is thinking about the kind of theories of cognition, is that children need to build on what they know and their experiences. So it might be that one of your comparators is something that is very familiar to children, but in reality, most children experience, obviously they live in areas and they experience areas, but whether they have got the knowledge to understand why it is the way it is probably the thing that needs to be unpicked first. But once they've got that, and because it is familiar to them, then making a comparison with somewhere else which is unfamiliar to them will become more straightforward. So I take those two sides, Anthony and Paul. Thank you for your question. It's a really good one.
Thanks, Ian. There's a question from Paris. Are there ever any crossovers between discrete, thematic, and schematic curriculum design?
Oh gosh, that's a good question. Yeah, I mean, typically schools choose, and you know, sometimes we do see hybrid. I think I've been in some schools fairly recently where I've seen that, where actually there's some discrete teaching of geography, but by the end of it, we might have a kind of thematic week where we pull together all the things we've been learning in geography and history and RE or whatever other subjects, music, and we pull it all together. And often countries are used as being the kind of theme, I guess, there. And the point that the research picked out is, one, there's been very little research done on this. So if you're into your academic research and you want to explore it in the primary space, then I am sure colleagues at the GA would be really keen to work with you in developing some research here. Is that the importance of respecting the discipline is the thing that comes through, and keeping the knowledge that you want children to know forefront and central to your thinking as you plan your curriculum. It is possible, and I've seen it done, and I know colleagues have seen it done, that we have teachers who are very expert in a good range of disciplines, and so consequently can do that. But equally, we've seen other colleagues who are at the other extreme and are novice or young in the profession, perhaps, or young in their experience and their knowledge, and so find it a real challenge. And actually what happens then is the subject knowledge is diluted or lost, and all children remember is wrapping up a classmate in kitchen roll, pretend to be an Egyptian mummy, and all the stuff on the River Nile that they should have been learning has gone to the wall. So I think that's the two things there. One is foreground the knowledge you want them to learn, and two, respect the discipline.
Thanks, Ian. Steve or Jen, any questions from you?
I've got one about, so say your children come into school with very low like cultural capital experiences, knowledge, like really quite lacking in that, as a, you know, that's a theme across your school. Is it okay to build on this so that they understand more? So doing like deeper but less, even if it means that you're not then able to cover all of the national curriculum?
Yeah, and I think you'd have to say, it's fair to say, Jen, you know, a national curriculum just gives us headings. The expectation is that the content of the national curriculum should be taught. If you're an academy, it's at least to the extent and the ambition of the national curriculum that should be taught. So I think we can't say, slim down the national curriculum, choose the bits you want to do, because actually it all interlinks anyway, and we know as good geographers, we need that interconnectedness to be understood and seen by our youngsters. But you'll prioritize things, you'll spend more time on certain things because they're more important for your community. And you know, that's one of the key things that I've spoken to our inspectors about, is that context is key. It's unusual in this set of presentations, because I was trying to keep it short, I haven't put in a slide that says context is key, but it absolutely is. And your geography curriculum, in the same way as your history curriculum or your RE curriculum, your English curriculum, whichever, will take a view based on what your children already know. And that's right. From an inspectorate point of view, we want to hear about your thinking and why you've come to those decisions that you have, and we need to understand your communities better. So yeah, you'll have your agenda and good reasons for it. At least one hopes you have. And and you've thought it through. And I think that's the most, you know, the one thing to say is it's the thinking that goes into creating a curriculum that is going to help you as subject leads or coordinators or head teachers overseeing a range of subjects, but also help me and colleagues like me as we get to understand kind of how you've developed and how you've designed your things. Thanks, Jen.
Thanks, Ian. Julia.
Sorry about that. Thanks very much for that overview, Ian. It's really helpful to hear about Ofsted's thinking, particularly how cog science ought to be influencing our thinking. One of the things that occurred to me, I was listening to you, is that many primary schools still, in effect, take a topic or thematic approach to managing the foundation subjects in their curriculum. And I was wondering, what does it look like when you've seen really good examples of that done well?
Good question, Julia. I mean, I guess I go back to the response we gave to Paris earlier. It is where the knowledge lines are really clear. So teachers are really clear in articulating what it is in the geography, you know, we're as geographers, so we're thinking it in the geography space, but they could be doing the same with their history or their music. And probably inducting children through their teaching into the ways of it. So we'll use inquiry in one particular way, our history colleagues will look at it in another. And so I guess it's in the best instances, teachers are really clear about what it is they want children to learn and the disciplinary approaches that are appropriate for the subject or subjects that they're trying to carry off. It's a challenge, but I say it can be done well. You can see some really good linkages that are often being drawn, so that you know, that can be very useful. You know, pedagogically, I guess we can say, and I'm thinking of some examples I've seen, we might teach a bit of something in the, you know, it's always in the afternoon, isn't it? But we might teach some geography in the afternoon, then we might teach some history, and then we might do some synoptic stuff in the afternoon, pulling links between them. And that can be hugely effective and empowering. It helps children organize their thinking a little bit more as well, because we're asking them to do a spatial organization for us, and our history colleagues are typically asking them to think in a kind of time order, longitudinal view. So we're coming at things from different angles, and that can be a real strength, but I wouldn't underestimate the level of challenge that it is.
Okay, thanks, Ian. That's really
Julia.
Thanks, Julia. One more question. Thanks, Ian. This is from Simon Catling. The word knowledge is frequently used about geographical knowledge and about what children know. What does this word cover? And big question, what is an appropriate balance? Okay, so I'll have to infer the second part, but in terms of what children know, I guess we're thinking about their facts, the knowledge from that point of view, the substantive information that we want youngsters to appreciate, but also we're thinking about procedural, you know, how to carry out a piece of fieldwork, how to analyze a map, how to interrogate an aerial photograph are all parts of knowledge, aren't they? The procedural knowledge. So I think in that respect, it is the what. You know, I think we can keep it as simple as what do we want children to know, and that probably is as simple as that. And from our point of view, from an inspectorate point of view, that's kind of how we're evaluating what do children now know that they didn't know before. That might be empowering them just in terms of their knowledge and their understanding of the world and how it functions, or it might be in how to go and carry out particular geographical skills or field work. Thanks, Ian. So I think that's questions for now, folks. So yeah, please feel free to keep on using the chat, and we'll move on to bang on 5:30, part 2. Look at that, timing is beautiful here. Right, here we go. So we'll go back into the slides. Okay, I should be back with you. Okay. Thank you. Right, great. Okie dokie. So pedagogy. So we've looked at the what and how we've organised our curriculum, and so now it's time to turn our thinking to why and how are we going to implement this curriculum. And I think that the point here is that the aim of the pedagogical choices that we make will be manifold, ensuring that the identified content, the what, that we've just been talking about, is remembered, of course,
but also promoting pupils' spatial thinking, developing pupils in the ways of geographers, and in securing that efficiency and fluency as geographers, being able to carry out their own studies effectively and efficiently. And the research also, I guess, points out the perils of being driven by popularization. So I think from that point of view, really we were looking at children being drawn away from the geography because we might be using things that are contextually really, I don't know, being promoted in the media at this point in time. The other thing that we picked up from the research was, and the literature was about teachers needing to be mindful of pupils' working memory, not overloading it. And I think that's really helpful, and we can think back to structuring a curriculum where, of course, we will need to have broken things down. There are little bits, as we build up that knowledge sequence to get to the more complex or composite ideas, the conceptual understanding, if you like, then we are building up step by step, and the curriculum will obviously reflect that. But then we can translate that into our implementation, and we need to be choosing activities and things that the children are going to do that are going to support that. The review explored literature on inquiry learning quite extensively, because there is I recognise from my own work and others, there is misunderstanding about what we mean by inquiry learning. And it points out that this approach, that the intention by this approach is that pupils process and connect knowledge and so support their good recall, but only when they're already insecure in the knowledge that they're going to need to carry out the inquiry. And by teachers ensuring the tasks within the inquiry are structured carefully to allow the pupils to build the various components to achieve those more complex curriculum goals, as opposed to the voyage of great discovery, which when done well, takes a lot of thinking and a lot of careful construction of activities for youngsters to get there. But we need to make sure they've got those reference points to come in with. The review also scoured the literature with respect to pupils with special educational needs and disabilities. References, to be fair to be said, were a little bit limited, but we were able to draw on some recent geography subject inspections that showed that most schools retained the same curriculum. The content was the same, but the teaching approaches were often quite different. There are, of course, occasions where pupils' needs are such that the curriculum might need to be modified for them. But I guess one thing we did pick out was that teaching assistants are identified in the review as colleagues who are often deployed to support the most needy of our pupils. And actually, they often don't have the subject knowledge themselves to match up to what they usually do have, which is a secure understanding of children's needs in that area. Visual impairment, colour blindness were two areas of which we've got much more that's been done. And I just put an example up there of some of the areas in which there's better research about ensuring access to the curriculum, but important for children with visual impairment, colour blindness, that our resources are adapted to meet their needs. And as we identified earlier, pupil engagement is really important, and the curriculum should build on those pupils' experiences that Jen was talking about earlier. However, the review also picked up on the risks that need to be borne in mind, particularly avoiding narrowing the geography curriculum, politicising teaching, losing subjectivity, and introducing inaccuracy or misheld views, really, because of the approach that's taken. So things that many of you on here recognise are very experienced geographers, things we would do in the everyday, but new colleagues might not know these things, and we've got to encourage them and help them in their development as learners in the teaching of our subject. We also know in geography that because of our cumulative nature that we've got here, is that our progress is rarely linear. And certainly the review draws quite heavily on Whedon and Hopkirk's work in this area, which picks up that the linear progress ladders that we see from time to time don't serve the geography curriculum particularly well. The research emphasised the function of assessments being there to allow pupils and teachers to evaluate what has been learned. We know that assessment is a continuous process. It happens every day in the class as teachers explore pupils' learning and their understanding. Periodically, teachers will want to assess more formally and might use some summative assessments. But where this is done well, they'll have been really carefully crafted. They'll test what's been learned. And the main purpose, the research suggests, should be to identify the specific gaps or misconceptions in pupils' knowledge, because that's what's going to reshape our future teaching, or might even result in us reshaping our curriculum. It might be from time to time there are certain aspects of the curriculum that are not understood, or where they are beyond that single cohort, then curriculum review will be necessary. If you keep seeing the same pattern of things changing, you're not going to keep doing the same thing. You're going to change what you do. So I think whether we are assessing formatively or as a teaching approach, so assessment as learning, or we're using it summatively, we're assessing the learning, then the purpose of assessment is really critical to improving the pupil's learning experience, and effectively them knowing more, remembering more, and being able to do more. There are, of course, factors which I've referred to earlier as the external factors, if you like. So the review concludes by looking at some of these, the wider issues that affect geography. These aren't in any particular order. In fact, I think I put them alphabetically so they weren't in any particular order. But in some schools, leaders have made decisions about things like the amount of time that's to be allocated to individual subjects, or nominally where they've adopted a topic-based approach, it's a nominal time allocation to it. And what the research showed us here was that the time allocated to geography has reduced. And so it really poses a challenge to ensure that pupils have properly learned the body of knowledge that the school has agreed they ought to learn. And for that purpose, I think just to pick up, often I get sent, or I see schools' intent statements, which are lovely in themselves. But my response was, what do you want them to know by the time they get to the end of year 2, the end of year 6, the end of reception, wherever you choose any point in time? You could say the end of the spring term when they're in year 3. It doesn't, but what are those milestones as they go through? Because ultimately your content is your intent. So when you're thinking, and if you are thinking about kind of I read one the other day, it was 3 pages long, bless it, and it gave me some great kind of principles and rationale. But my next question to them was, what do you actually want the children to know? So bear that in mind if you are thinking about that. And of course, know that we need to at least match the scope of the national curriculum. Another significant factor that we pulled out from both research and some of our evidence retrieval was that subject, pedagogical and disciplinary knowledge of teaching staff is variable. Very few primary teachers we know, less than 3 in 100, have a geography background beyond GCSE, let alone A-level. So this therefore raises the importance of in-service training for staff to ensure that they're suitably knowledgeable. We reference in the review the Geography Association, the Royal Geographical Society, and of course there are many others out there, but they're probably the 2 main supporters for the sector in this point. And the people we would, we've identified in the report as producing much of the resource. And in fact, if you look down the bibliography at the end, you'll see very, very many references come from GA publications or from RGS publications, because these are the people who are doing most of the research. We're fortunate in our community that most of our research is very much led by the sector, and grateful to colleagues for the work that they do there and publish. And linked to this is ensuring that anyone leading geography is suitably knowledgeable. A blog from the Outstanding Schools geography inspections found that there were lots of different models being used to ensure this was realised, from soft to hard federations with single lead across, or collaborations across schools, all primaries, or across primaries and secondaries. Or we've got new models with multi-academy trusts and the rise of the lead practitioner. I go to the lead practitioner network meeting most years, and it's bigger every year. It's getting bigger and bigger as that line has has journeyed and emerged as a new kind of concept, something we've not had before. Many local authorities still provide some support and service in this area as well, but subject leadership is important. We're only going to get better if we can objectively evaluate where we're at and develop a plan that's going to take us forward and implement it well. And then I guess the last point I pull out here is around the dynamic nature of the subject and the impacts that that has. One, on teacher subject knowledge and the need for us to keep up to date. We're always reading. Anthony shared with you Primary Geography magazine, freshly hot off the press, but equally other journals and periodicals that we can read to keep ourselves up to date in the geography of it. Unfortunately, in the common media, we don't get quite so much the geography exemplified, but many people behind the scenes are writing other resources for us. But things like other resources will become outdated or obsolete. So maps and atlases do become outdated from time to time. Views change. Part of our discipline is respecting different viewpoints and standpoints on things, and we know that views change over time, or representations of aspects of our world change as we progress. And often in the texts we use, we think, gosh, I look back at some of the texts I started teaching with in the 90s, which were generally texts from the 70s, and think, gosh, I wouldn't use them now, or gosh, did I really use them? And when I was a newly qualified, I was a probationer teacher. That shows you how old I am. Maps, and so as I say, we need to keep an eye on our maps and our atlases, our globes, make sure they're up to date and keep them used. Hopefully they're used so well they become so fingered and well used. We need to replace them more frequently than we get a reorganization of countries in Central Africa or wherever. But also we found that pupils are really motivated by the use of live or real-time data, and that now is really accessible to us. So and really helpful because we know it's contemporary information. So presents us with a challenge of accessing it and processing it ourselves, and one recognizes there is a workload implication there for teachers. But again, there's thinking there around organization and leadership about how we can do these things efficiently. But they've all got resourcing implications, fieldwork in itself, and I think one thing I'm banging on about, I guess, at the moment is not conflating field work and field trips. We can teach field work in a classroom, we can practice it in our school grounds or at the school gate. Helpfully, sometimes we'll go to other places where we can actually practice properly and not just simulate it. But nonetheless, these have all got resource implications, and we don't underestimate that the factors in schools that can constrain some of those choices, but they're choices that head teachers, governors, trustees are making. And I guess our job, if you're a subject lead for geography, our job is to explore with them and to probably convince in some cases the importance and show them that the need and the significance of some of these activities that we do and how they're benefiting children, not just in the geography but more holistically as well. But it has ever been thus. I remember pleading my case with head teachers over the years with varying degrees of success. So as I say, this is a whistle-stop tour. Appreciate that. I'm only really picking up on the highlights of the research review. We've published 7 so far. So if you're a head teacher, there's lots for you to read. If you're just the geography lead, then you can just focus on the geography one. But they give you some of the thinking that we've put into our inspector training and our thinking here. Please bear in mind they've been written through the lens of the education inspection framework. So they're not an all-encompassing review of all the literature and all the research that's been done in geography education. Far from it. They look at some very specific aspects that marry with our education inspection framework. So there are as many omissions as there are inclusions. And as I said at the start, helpfully we're seeing schools who are using them as a discussion tool or as a springboard to go and do more reading, so that the school's curriculum view is better informed going forward. And some people have said, actually the list of texts at the back is as much use as the rest of it, because it signposts us in a way of places we can go and start to glean literature and read around the subject, which is all handily now in one place. So with those caveats, I encourage you to have a look at some of them. For those on a time budget and you've only got 10 or 15 minutes, then I'm sure I've flogged this before, but in March, January, February and March 2020, we visited 23 primary schools, all outstanding at their last inspection, and we explored their geography curriculum. And I wrote a blog for them. It'll literally take you 10 minutes to read it, if that. My colleague, Michael Wardle and Tim Jenner in history wrote 2 as well for their subjects. So they're out there very quick, give you a précis of kind of what's going on. And coming in the future, though the timeline for geography I do not know, but there will be a state of the nation, if you like, a subject report coming out from Ofsted at some point. I would think probably more 2022, 2023 for geography. As we glean more information from our inspections, but as you know, the disruption that the pandemic's caused to teaching meant that we suspended routine inspections, so we haven't got that evidence that we can just go and garner in and evaluate at this point in time. So, but keep your eyes peeled. There'll be more coming soon. Anthony, any more questions that people have got? I'll stop sharing my screen again.
Ian, thank you. Lots of questions coming in
from
various people. So I'll just go to those. Forgive me, just scroll back up again. So certainly there was a comment from Jen about the SEND discussion that you started off with. And this is what Jen said. Often people end up scaffolding SEND children in geography through literacy ability rather than geographical ability. Are there any good ideas, resources, articles to support perhaps non-specialists, as you said, most teachers who haven't got a background training, kind of A-level degree, whatever, in geography, how they might scaffold SEND children in geography?
I'd love to say there's a simple answer to that, but I guess on the basis that every child's special educational need is unique to them, then there is no easy answer. This is where the craft of the teacher really comes to the fore. Usually special educational needs coordinators can help sometimes with those who've got more significant needs. Then there'll be specialist input. I know I used to teach in a school with a visually impaired unit. We got very good input about how we should adapt our teaching so that those youngsters who had limited or no sight could access the curriculum. But I have to genuinely say, no, there isn't. There isn't a simple answer to this one. It will depend on each child's particular needs. I agree the literacy based approaches is not always helpful because actually some children are very conceptually very geographically advanced. So it's not always the kind of that kind of approach doesn't always help us.
Thank you. Colleagues, other questions that you picked out that you would highlight from the chat? One here that jumps out from Simon is how can primary teachers keep up to date in all the primary subjects, given the pressures on the 3 Rs? Because obviously we're advocating broad and balanced, aren't we now?
We certainly are. I mean, I think this is the bit where, if I think of examples when I've been out and about or colleagues been out and about of where good subject coordination, subject leadership, if you like, comes in that, where people are focusing on one particular area, they can share with colleagues things that are useful to them. I think probably the pandemic has done us some favors in terms of accessing training events like this. Fabulous. That we get, I think the last one I did, we had over 100. There's about 90 odd folk here today. So the ability to kind of zoom in for an hour and pick up on stuff rather than taking that day out where you go and do 6 hours on a course somewhere and bring back 1 or 2 things that you might have remembered. I've meant we can get greater access to things that are a bit more specific. I know I've participated in some myself. I, like you, need to keep up to date. And so certainly I've done some on meteorology, I've done some on tectonics myself, just to get in with the latest thinking about what's going on from specialists. So I think, but how did I find out about them? Okay, I'm part of the network. And I guess they're where either as an individual member of staff or as a subject leader, you're in the networks and you're getting the information flowing through, then you can highlight that to colleagues and access it better. I think we underestimate the value of reading around. and reading to influence our teaching. Sometimes at the level of the subject. I think often I did it myself when I was in school leadership. I would pass out books on, that motivational people have written about how to motivate youngsters and all the rest. But actually, most motivation of youngsters comes through success. We want them to be successful in geography. So actually, therefore, I need to know the geography the best and get that out there. So I think in that respect, reading around is probably something that's undervalued or underrepresented in our CPD. And just having discussions, I was in school last week where they were having a debate about kind of some of the aspects of their curriculum and how it was organized and shaped, and they were reviewing it because they had a good old debate about it during the lockdown as they kind of restructured, and they were now implementing it, and they were debating its implementation. Was it working well enough or not? Having that discussion with colleagues, is good CPD in itself, So whilst we've got RGS, GA and others out there providing us with lots and lots of information, actually a good discussion with colleagues is going to get us a long way as well. So I think there's probably lots of different ways to keep up to date. But I would, if I could say one thing is good subject leadership is going to get that pertinent information to the right people at the right time, because we can't read it all. That's a given.
Thanks, Ian. Kate, have you got a question?
Yeah, Stephen Scoffham has asked, I think it kind of follows on from that last question. I was wondering about ways of promoting that love of geography, and is there anything that you would suggest is a good way of doing that?
Great teachers make children enthused, motivated, and go there. What makes a great teacher? Well, their knowledge about their subject, and they use good methods to engage their youngsters. So I think to some extent it all comes back to the same question, which is about staff subject knowledge and their pedagogical understanding of our discipline. We can jazz it up and we can choose things in the curriculum. I am as guilty as charged, my lad, for teaching year 9. Anything where I could get a field trip involved just before they made their options. So we can do all of these things, we can play all of these games, but actually it tends to be the enthusiasm and the passion of class teachers which makes the difference. And certainly in my experience, and I've been kicking around for about 25 years now in this space. And I guess it comes down to that, having useful resources, connecting it in, and ultimately children experiencing success, and really those penny dropping moments. I think thinking standing back in classrooms at that moment when you get the I've got it kind of moments, and you think yes, that's it, and you get that momentum and that drive that they want to know more, they want to learn more, they come in enthusiastic. I ended up teaching in reception in year 1, and youngsters coming in the following morning asking me all sorts of questions about things we'd just talked about the previous day or we'd looked at the previous day, and coming in with those questions and the enthusiasm and the passion for it, because they'd gone home and they'd looked at something and seen that whatever they'd explored or discovered or talked to granddad about or whatever it was, and we just capitalize on that and very much move it forward. We're a people business, and I think sometimes we forget that.
Thanks, Ian. Julia.
Can you hear me now? Yeah,
okay,
thank you. Sorry, it was muted and I couldn't unmute myself. There's a really good question here from Sophie Harris, Ian, which I think a lot of people would likely be interested to hear your answer. She asked, what would good intent include? Would you want to see progression of skills alongside the specific knowledge for each year group in school?
Okay.
Very practical.
That is great. Yeah, and we do the research review picks up on that. So if I take it in reverse order, skills integration, we know we have to discreetly teach stuff first. Yeah, we know that we can't just kind of integrate everything. So there will be things we have to teach, and but then integrating it there and after, applying it in I don't know, perhaps we're looking at particular processes or whatever else, and we're drawing in, if we say we're using map skills, drawing it in is going to make it really sticky for youngsters. They're going to really remember it. They will get to practice more, so they get that fluency, that automaticity. They know it and they can do it. They experience and that success that we've just been talking about. So yes, I think that is, absolutely. Once we've taught it and shown them the procedures that we do as geographers, then yeah, absolutely. Where we can integrate, we know, and the research shows us that has maximum impact. In terms of intent is your content. So what are you teaching? How, in terms of organization, are you going to set it all up with what intended aim? So yeah, sometimes you do have these phrases at the start, we're going to have world citizens who make informed decisions and da 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 da. Great, lovely. So how are we going to get there? What are we actually going to teach? And what are we going to emphasize? So we've got our national curriculum. It's beautifully broad for us. It gives us no specificity, really. So we can whittle down and we can identify what it is that's important for our youngsters to learn. We can pick out, that there are useful comparisons that we can make based on their known and lived experience. I taught in inner city Bradford for a long time. We spent quite a lot of time looking at Bangladesh and Pakistan because youngsters could relate to it. But when I moved to Cornwall, I wasn't teaching about Bangladesh and Pakistan, because it was too alien a concept for the youngsters. We struggled to make those connections. We studied the Middle East instead, but there we go. Yeah, so you make your choices based on your children's needs. It's the point, I think Jen mentioned it in the first Q&A, based on your children's knowledge and their needs. It's absolutely critical. We've got those headings in the national curriculum. They're really helpful too. So they give us the kind of broad outline, the skeleton, if you like.
Okay, thanks very much, Ian.
Thank you, Julia.
Sophie, does that answer your question? Because I know you've just popped up and you can unmute if you like.
It does, thank you.
Great.
Thanks, Sophie. Any other questions that you picked up, colleagues? There's quite a debate in the chat about weather, and I know, Ian, you mentioned the wind and weather. Have you got any comments on that in particular?
I think just don't underestimate the importance of teaching about weather and climate. We know that there are two major things that underpin all geography. That which is beneath our feet, the geology of the earth, and that which is happening in our atmosphere. And those two things together influence, all of our geographical processes, pretty much, to some extent or another. So don't I'm not a meteorologist or a climatologist. In fact, if I had to be very honest, I'd say they're the bits of geography that I least enjoyed learning about and teaching about. But I recognise their importance, and there are some things we have to do in life because we have to do them for good reason. For me, weather and climate was one of them. But when you see children trying to be, people are trying to teach the concept of the biome, and children don't understand climate. Worse, or more, not worse, but to exemplify even more, the concept of latitude is not known. If the concept of latitude specified in our Key Stage 2 national curriculum isn't understood, then children's understanding of most of how our world operates is going to be pretty superficial. So, class teachers out there, if you've got year 3 or maybe you're beginning year 4, and youngsters aren't secure in latitude, then I would heartily recommend, from the heart of a geographer, not with the head of an HMI on here, but the heart of an HMI on here, but from the heart of a geographer, of these are important concepts that children must understand. Otherwise, we're gonna just be battling, and you will not get those efficiencies. So when we're working in constrained time, which we all are, it doesn't matter which subject you are, everybody will say we don't get enough time. Then we have to do things smarter. So it's an investment. Geology and meteorology are definitely investments of time, and I think critically, ones which, especially the meteorology, looking at the weather, components of the weather can be studied by children in the early years without any problem, because it happens around, in this country, you can have 4 seasons in one day. So, it happens around them all the time. They can go and experience it, and anemometers are cheap as chips. You can go out there and you can measure wind speed, you can get some compasses out, and you can do wind directions as well. You can see how it changes, and things are really tangible. So dead easy to get into. So yeah, I'd say, as someone who's not a massive fan of teaching weather and climate, I would promote it, but equally get that latitude and longitude in there at early doors as well. It would be my strong suggestion. Paula's nodding. She's the primary expert, and Stephen, he's there too, smiling greatly. They're the only 2 people I can see on the screen. That's. I'm sure there are others nodding. Oh, there you go. Steve's come up. He's there too. So.
Thanks, Ian. Paula, anything to add to that? From what Ian's just said, you've put some things in the chat. Go Jetters, for example.
I had to get GeogLive in there because there are a few useful diagrams in there, but Ian's advice was great, especially about getting latitude in there early. I couldn't agree more. And I think it fits in really nicely in years 3 or 4 when you're introducing climate zones to get that understanding to kind of foreground everything else that happens in Key Stage 2. So I think that's really great advice. Thanks, Ian.
No, that's fine.
Colleagues, anything else in the chat? Excuse me. Anything else in the chat that you have picked up that you think would be worth referencing at this point?
Anthony, Trish came up with a really good comment, a question right at the start of the evening, and that is, Ian, from your time at Ofsted, if you had one key message for primary practitioners, what would it be? Teach
some geography. It really is that simple. You know, I debated and discussed with senior colleagues in Ofsted when we were doing the research review. I said, I'm going to foreground the knowledge that children should learn. I don't think many of the other colleagues have done that. But in geography, do you know what? I see so little of it. It's really quite painful. And as somebody who's been in this business for a while, this is my little chance to make a mark on the sector and trying to promote geographical education. But yeah, please, can we have a bit more geography would be my one thing.
Thank you.
Thanks, colleagues. So there may be time for one more question before we finish. There is a survey in the chat if you would be good enough to fill that in. Some of you have joined us a little bit late, so I'm just going to finally share a couple of slides with you all before we finish. We've come right up to the end of our hour together. Thank you very much for joining us all. Remember, this is a presentation of the Early Years and Primary Phase Committee of the Geographical Association. We'd love you to be a free primary member. You can Google that and find that, or join us to get access to the amazing materials like the magazine that's dropped on my doorstep today. Remember, the 17th of November at 5 p.m, there is a focus on maps and mapping. So look out on Twitter, which is presumably where you found out about this, to hear about that. That's our next live online event. And remember the 2 conferences I mentioned right at the beginning, and the details are there. We do wish that you have a really good geographical year this year. The association is here to help and support. I know there were some people in the chat asking for CPD. There are plenty of Geographical Association consultants if you want to look into that. If you just Google GA consultants, you can find a list of somebody in your area. But if there's any final questions, colleagues, I'll go over to you to unmute and just put Ian on the spot for one final time. If you could fill in the survey, though, that would be really, really wonderful. And Ian just put some links in the chat as well for everybody.